Good afternoon. Our next speaker is Rick Rule, who was earlier the chairman of Sprott US Holdings, and he now runs Rule Investment Media to educate and help investors become successful. He has made a name for himself in the natural resources sector, and he's passionate about helping young people succeed and guides them on how to grow their wealth. He wants to today talk about how to pass on the liberty message to people. The title of his talk is Time to Fight Back, Techniques for Spreading the Liberty Message. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Rick Rule.
I want to begin by copying my young friend, Jay Martin, who also puts on conferences. Putting on a conference is really analogous to herding cats. It's unbelievably difficult. So please join me in a round of applause for Jayant and Rajni for putting on this fine conference. As a veteran speaker, I always try to figure out one way to get an applause line. You've all been tricked. You applauded me, meaning to applaud for Jay and Rajni, so thank you. Well, great morning this morning. Walter Block, Chris Baker, Jay Martin, Ken Royce, Maxine Bernier. Very high intellectual tone, a lot of purpose. Now you got Rick Rule, that's all over. My assigned speech, Fight Back, the Techniques for Spreading the Liberty Message. I've decided to rename it Fight Back, Propaganda for Fun and Profit. I want to begin by saying that people who believe like we do, people who believe in liberty, how do I say this politely? People who would prefer not to mess with other people in return for other people not messing with them, when they look at the world, they tend to be pessimistic because so many people in the world, even good people, think if I could just make other people think the way I think, the world would be a better place. And we look at even well-meaning people trying to control the lives of others. And I think it causes us to be too pessimistic. When even the people that we like, we begin to view as our oppressors, we don't look for the signs of spreading liberty. One of the reasons why I love the talk this morning about what's going on in Argentina. And I want to begin by introducing a note of optimism. When I was a young student, right here in Vancouver, British Columbia, we'll talk about immigration later, maybe it was me, but I couldn't spell libertarian. Now I'm a director of something called Students for Liberty. 160,000 kids came to our lectures last year. So, I mean, think about what the population of campus libertarians was in 1970, somewhere between 0 and 10. And last year, 160,000 kids came to our lectures, just one group. The point is that pessimism is, first of all, false, but it's also futile. I'm not suggesting that all of you have any duty to be propagandists for liberty. I don't want to convey any obligation on you. But to the extent that it would amuse you, to the extent that you want to continue on the work that others have felt, and by the way, have some fun doing it, I'm going to suggest to you that there have been some changes in society and some changes in the way that information is distributed that make it more possible today than ever before. Albert Liu is in the room somewhere. Albert, raise your hand. If you had asked Albert if there was anybody in the world less likely to adopt himself to social media, he would have said the least likely person on the whole planet to adapt to social media was Rick Rule. Partly I've been able to do that because the hard part of social media, the technology part, Albert does for me. But I would suggest to you that the prevalence of social media has disrupted the way conversations are dispersed around the world. In the 1970s, when I was trying to promote my business broadly, I had to cause myself to be quoted in places like the Wall Street Journal and other places. It was very, very, very difficult to get one's message across because there was bottlenecks in the distribution of information. Financial information was controlled by the financial press, or it was controlled by the investment banks, or it was controlled by the asset managers, or it was controlled by the wealth managers. But that's no longer true. For better or for worse, there's a whole bunch of discourse that takes place in messy but uncontrolled, or at least semi-uncontrolled places like Twitter, like Facebook, like LinkedIn, like YouTube. However you might feel about those mediums, there are ways that you can use them for amusement, for profit, or for propaganda. And I'm going to try to talk about all of those in the time that I have left. But what I want to start with is that this bottleneck that used to exist with regards to the distribution of information and, dare I say, the distribution of propaganda is gone. You can access discussions that take place around the world, and you can do it from the convenience of your own home. I became aware of the possibilities of this by studying, first of all, one of my mentors, Doug Casey. Doug Casey had a wonderful way, because he had a great reputation as a speculator, and people were attracted to the work of Doug Casey because of the simplicity of financial copy. The world is going to end on Thursday, and here's how you can profit. And this whole sort of circumstance where Doug Casey attracted to people who were interested in how they could improve themselves as speculators acquired, perhaps inadvertently, all of the propaganda that Doug Casey was able to offer up about free markets. His diagnosis of what was wrong with the world was a very libertarian diagnosis. And his diagnosis, too, about how you could defend yourself from the people in government and out of government that were trying to keep you poor, or at least keep you from getting rich, was very, very libertarian. People subscribed to Doug Casey because they hoped that he would give them a penny stock that would quintuple in the next year. What they got, along with that, was a very, very, very stout dose of anarcho-capitalism, masking as self-help. And I admired that about Doug. Little later on, through Doug, I met a guy named Bill Bonner. Bill Bonner is the founder and the largest shareholder of Agora. Many people don't know, but Agora is the largest financial publisher in the world, substantially larger than Dow Jones, the publisher of the Wall Street Journal. And Agora exists really in its current form as a consequence of understanding how to market through social media, how to reduce their distribution cost, and how to increase their universe without resorting to display advertising. The key part of that technique, and the part that I want you to begin to understand how to emulate today, pardon me, was a product called the Daily Reckoning. What Agora figured out is that the most effective advertising that you can offer up is advertising that conveys an immediate benefit to the buyer. Not a display ad that says, buy my shit, right? Nothing like that. Education. Give away paradigm. Give away the argument. Even give away the technique. Once you've established the credibility by giving away paradigm, by giving away technique, you can sell people a branded conclusion. The Daily Reckoning had between 4,000 and 4,500 words a day that had real benefit. They taught real lessons. There was a real cost to produce it. The circulation, after about a year and a half, was over 1 million people. Now, I'm not trying to say that 1 million people a day read the Daily Reckoning, but enough people read the Daily Reckoning every day that Bill was able to insert 3 different pieces of advertising in the Daily Reckoning for his own newsletters, His marginal cost of producing those newsletters for a new customer, because they were distributed electronically, was zero, which is to say his return on that advertising was infinite. His gross was his net. And this free publication, free to the consumer, in fact, benefited the consumer, was selling, at that point in time, about $2.5 or $3 million a month worth of products at 100% margin. And it was that that really caused me to begin thinking about social media. Move forward to 2010, 2011. I had just sold my own business to Sprott. And at Sprott, we were doing a lot of soul searching about the fact that our principal line of precious metals was confronted with a dilemma, which is to say that most of our customers were dying. Our demographic were old, fat, bald, white guys. People that had been attracted to gold during the decade of the 70s. And I'm not trying to say that the market was becoming bored. That was true too. Our market was literally dying. And we were trying to figure out, how do we reach younger people? And we did all kinds of strange stuff. We actually had like focus groups that financial PR firms did with young people, and I mean, it was just this insane stuff. And we tried various forms of advertising, including the dumbest thing we ever did, which was sort of a display ad on over Times Square, you know, advertising gold to all the panhandlers and the junkies and stuff. And I mean, we did some profoundly stupid stuff. What I started doing, accidentally, was experimenting with social media, because I was trying to figure out a way to more cheaply increase our market share among gold bugs. I had proven fairly conclusively that display ads didn't work. And so I thought, well, I gotta look at this new stuff, this online stuff, because it might be that these old folks who believe like I do but don't know about our products would begin to do business with me if I reached them there. I was trying to work through an information bottleneck. Working through this information bottleneck, trying to reach old, fat, bald, white guys like myself, had a very, very, very unintended consequence, which was the young audience that we couldn't figure out how to reach reached out to us when we met them where they were. I want you to store this message, because the rest of what I'm going to talk about is all about that. What social media is all about is avoiding bottlenecks and reaching a global market, a black market, a white market, a brown market, a red market, a female market, a male market, an old market, a young market. It's all out there, and it's all free to access. And you can access it for almost anything you want, as those of you who are on social media probably understand. The part that excites me about talking to this audience is you can do what Doug Casey did. You can use your expertise in something that you're good at, in something that you have experience at, in something that you can utilize to transmit a message which is useful to other people. You have to be useful to other people. What segregates your message, what builds trust for you, is not advertising so much as informing, utilizing your expertise. It might be that Ken Royce decides to start blogging about firearms and shooting. There's lots of people who care about guns. Many of them probably shouldn't, but they do. And the fact is, if you utilize expertise that you have in one area, where your expertise is A, recognizable, but B, useful, you attract people to you and you become recognized as an expert. What people often do, in fact, most often do, is if someone has established credibility in one aspect of their life, and people begin to respect them, people begin to trust them, people begin to listen to them, they acquire credibility in other aspects. As an example, spreading the message of liberty, much like Doug Casey has been able to do. How do we do this? How do we do this? Well, first of all, if it doesn't interest you, don't do it, okay? Don't set yourself up to fail. But if you do have lessons to teach, if you do have information that you can distribute to people that they will benefit from directly and they will feel by all means, do it on social media. Engage very broadly. What you learn with regards to this process is that economics, in a sense, gets turned on its head. Often we think that the scarcity is what sells. That's not what sells in messaging. Ubiquity sells. So engage very broadly, engage very repeatedly. Agora learned statistically that the 12th time, or no, a different way, it took an average of 12, quote, beneficial engagements. A beneficial engagement is where the viewer, the reader, felt that they had benefited from the information that they received. It took an average of 12 beneficial contacts before somebody liked them or trusted them enough to write a check. Okay? They also showed that the third time somebody received exactly the same pitch had the highest response rate. You might think that you're harassing people, but if that harassment conveys a benefit to the customer, you're not harassing them, you're benefiting. The fact that the third time somebody read the same pitch had the highest level of engagement tells me that ubiquity overcomes lack of familiarity, and it overcomes procrastination. So remember ubiquity. Remember again that you have to generate utility. That's the important part of it. And please, too, I've made this mistake. Don't have your propaganda message too confrontational or too complex. Often among libertarians, even when we're approaching non-libertarian issues, we try to define ourselves too narrowly. ANCAPs, proto-libertarian, paedo-libertarian, thick libertarian, thin libertarian. I guess, looking at me, I'm a thick libertarian. What matters in terms of reaching out to an outside audience is benefit to buyer, and do you want the world to be more free or less free? From my viewpoint, the libertarian message, if you look at the whole sphere of human existence and belief, and let's say that there's 360 degrees of that sphere, what separates us internally is about 3 degrees of that 360 degrees, okay? So worry about the 357 degrees that we don't have before you chop up the 3% that we do have. Everybody with me so far? This message shouldn't be about segregating this message. It should be about unifying the message and getting preliminary agreement that everybody in the world is better off more free than less free. Now, let's talk about techniques. Albert will tell you I've tried just about every technique on the planet, failed at most of them with regards to this message. But there are a few things that my experience in social media has taught me, all of which, by the way, I should have understood simply by watching Bill Bonner. But I had to make these mistakes personally. I had to segregate out what worked for me so that I could continue with that. The first is that, and the necessary precondition of this is, first of all, that you care to do it. And second of all, that you have some area of expertise within yourself where you have actual lessons to teach that have value to other people. If you've established that, you begin by accessing other people's networks. I was able to do this at Agora. At Agora, there were probably, when I started utilizing their distribution channels, they probably had 80 editors. And for many of the editors, remember this is back in the days of print newsletters, that the editor had to have a newsletter. They had to have copy ready on about the 21st of the month so that it could be edited, produced, and distributed to readers by the 1st of the next month. Very often on the 19th of the month, which is to say a day before deadline, the editors didn't have any copy yet, which means that, like college students, they had to pull an all-nighter. What I learned is that if I could introduce ideas to those letter writers, sometimes very thorough ideas, which is to say copy that I wrote and they plagiarized, that in fact my idea would populate their letter. And the same circumstance occurs today in social media. Many broadcasters, many people who are engaged in social media today are content short. They're audience long, content short. To the extent that you can be introduced to them as an expert, To the extent that they can borrow your content to distribute, what they're doing is building your audience. So engage other networks, particularly when you don't have a network for yourself when you're beginning. Those of you who follow me online know that I will try just about any podcaster or any information distributor that I don't find to be personally loathsome. I have addressed things like student cells in Goma, Congo. I mean, I've really treated, and by the way, I've had a ball doing that. But it's important that you engage other networks to build your own. And when I say engage, I mean that. Too often, when people are involved propagandizing on social media, they're doing it to vent. Their opening statement is this effing a-hole, blah, 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 blah. They're doing it, you know, to sort of unload on the world. Engage, don't insult. Absolutely engage, don't insult. The beginning of the message has to invite non-involved participants and even opponents to your point of view. Find a place to agree with them before you persuade them. Don't dissuade them in your opening content. The next one's really simple. Most of communication is nonverbal. When you're speaking in video, by the way, video, well, let's do it differently. Audio is more persuasive than writing. It just is, trust me. And video is more persuasive than audio. A lot of communication is nonverbal. What does that mean? Be understandable, be likable, speak slowly, smile. Invite people into the conversation. This is really, really simple stuff. But if you look at some of the video product online, even if you agree with that person, they're so odious, they're so angry, they're so hateful that you don't want to agree. You don't want to identify with that person. You want to identify with a good person, a nice person, a likable person, a person who you'd like to have a discussion with over a beer or over coffee, not somebody who, even though you agree with them, you'd like to avoid at all cost. Utilize news, because news increases viewership. The best, by the way, at utilizing news are the politicians. I'm not saying that you emulate the politicians in terms of their style, in terms of their message or anything like that, but absolutely, absolutely emulate their social media strategies. The Prime Minister of this country, the President of my country, I'm not fans of either of them, but their social media strategies are really pretty good. Utilize news and utilize the comment on that news to attract people's attention, but then utilize your own point of view to personalize the news, utilize the news to spread your message. Utilize news for engagement, but remember too to stick with what you know. Don't try to lecture people outside your area of expertise. Don't try to give speculative information, which could later be held against you. It's all about utility. It's all about demonstrating utility to the buyer and then using that utility to add credibility to your own message. Utilize slogans and utilize icons. When I began as a public speaker, again, a great critic of mine was Doug Casey. He was wonderful. You know, he said, "Rick, you explained that so thoroughly that you put the whole room to sleep." You know, you spend sort of, I guess maybe you speak the way you think you'd like to be spoken to, and you try to defend your point of view so completely thoroughly that there could be no disagreement with you. The fact is, if people have chose to listen to you, they already believe yourself to be an expert. You don't have to defend your credibility. You have to make the point. An icon is memorable. A slogan is memorable. A 12-minute dissertation is not memorable. When I try to teach people how to be investors in natural resources, capital-intensive cyclical businesses, I can describe the copper cycle, which Jay has probably had to suffer through in the past. I can discuss the fossil fuel cycle, all that kind of stuff. And you know, the 3 or 4 people who stay awake come out of that discussion agreeing with me. Or I can say, in resources, you are either a contrarian or you're going to be a victim. That slogan conveys everything that my example was going to convey, but people remember it, and they remember it for the rest of time. And should they care to engage more deeply with me in the topic, it's that slogan that, how could I say, frames their understanding of the discussion that takes place after. Is everybody with me so far? I know I'm going through this pretty fast. I'm actually going through 20 years of mistakes in 12 easy lessons. So if I go too fast, slow me up. But it's really important that you use slogans, and it's really important too, if you can, to use icons. It's important because that aids people in remembering the message, and it codifies the message too. It engages and eases memory. Foster engagement. Foster engagement, particularly when people are asking you questions or disputing things. If I have a libertarian message, or if I have an investor message that's difficult for the other person to engage with, and they utilize the yes, but defense, what they're saying is that they kind of agree with you, but they don't want to agree with you. And they bring up some objection to that, a specific objection. There's 2 possible rebuttals. The first rebuttal is the normal one. You're a moron. You're wrong. This objection that you raised is 1 in 10,000, and hence not valuable. You just lost somebody that you worked hard to gain. So what do you do instead? How many people here went through sales training ever? Oh boy, I can tell you guys anything. Okay, the technique for this is called feel, felt, found. You want to establish agreement with the other party. And you can always find something to agree with them on. You know, let's say, I don't know, let's say that their concern about libertarianism is that it's, you know, unfair to the poor or something like that. I would engage with that to begin with by saying, boy, do I understand how you feel. You know, there's a billion people on Earth who still, after 40 years of our trying, don't have access to a quality of life that's sustainable. And it isn't just in other countries, it's in this country too. In other words, you're establishing that you understand how they feel. Then I say, and you know, for a long time, I felt that objection obviated the point that I'm trying to make. I get that. You're still agreeing with them, right? I hear you. I empathize with you. That's more sincere than sympathy, anytime. And then you spring the trap. As I thought about it, as I thought about what I feel, what you feel, and I thought about how I felt, what I found was this. I found that poverty was more commonly the consequence of government. Poverty was more commonly the consequence of social control. Poverty was more commonly the absence of self-reliance. So I absolutely, thank you, I absolutely believe that rather than try and confront somebody, however tempting that might be, however stupid their objection might be, that you find areas of agreement and you use what I call intellectual jujitsu to cause them to come to your point of view, and understand that they're not going to come to your point of view in that conversation. You are trying to influence the way that people think so that they come to agree with you over a decade, not over an hour. The conversation that you're having today is meant to begin to change the way that people think over time. Referring again to Doug Casey, many, many years ago, when I was first hanging out with Doug Casey and his great friend John Pugsley, rest in peace. I was visiting with them, and I would describe myself at that point in time as apolitical, or perhaps libertarian, but again, couldn't spell it. And I remember having a discussion with them very early on. I was interested in investing, I was interested in speculating, and they were having a discussion about politics. And I was feigning interest, but I actually wasn't interested. And Pugsley said to me, "So Rick, what are your politics?" And I don't want to offend anybody. So I said, "Well, you know, I don't really have any. I guess that the equation that I like is, if I left you alone, would you leave me alone?" And Pugsley said, "Oh, well, you're a libertarian." And I thought libertarians at that point in time were people that hung out in the airports with signs that said, you know, kill Jane Fonda, blow up whales, stuff like that. And, you know, I thought Jane Fonda was prettier than Lyndon LaRouche, and I had nothing against whales. And I sort of told this to Pugsley. He was very gentle because he understood the process that he was going to win me. He understood the process that he was going to win me over in 5 years, not 5 minutes. He gave me a copy of Economics in One Lesson, sort of like a doctor would give you an aspirin. You know, read this, call me back in the morning. Understanding the process that he wasn't going to convert me that day, that he was going to introduce me to a line of reasoning which would cause me to come to his point of view over 5 years. And that is what you're about. That's what the feel, felt, found thing is all about. You're not winning them in the moment. You don't come away feeling like you conquered a person in conversation. What you do is you inculcate them with the ability to question what they feel at that point in time and change over time, the same way that John Pugsley did with me. I talked about benefit to buyer. Too often in social media, the commentator leads with I, me. But the buyer doesn't care about you. The buyer cares about themselves. So the lead-in and the point of the conversation is you, we, us, not I, me. You follow me with this? Too often people engage in social media to unload, to voice their own frustrations. Now, voicing frustration, as we've seen from politicians, can really work. But if you do that, you don't talk about my frustration. You talk about our frustration or your frustration. You with me? It's not about you. It's about your audience. So the words that you lead and the whole discussion is we, you. It's all benefit to buyer. One of the things that I've been able to do with this is because people are attracted to me as an investor, as a person who's made money, as a communicator. And when I'm looking to sell both financial self-improvement, but liberty, particularly when I talk to younger audiences, I say, if you take nothing else from this, take away 4 books. By the way, that's a slogan. I'm going to cause you now to be interested in 4 things, right? 4 things. I say, I want you to read 4 books. I want you to read Economics in One Lesson. I want you to do that because that is a necessary precondition of making money. You have to learn about the way things are, not the way the big thinkers want them to be. So the benefit of being both good financial advice and also good propaganda for liberty. Once you've gotten through that, and by the way, don't just buy the book, read it. Once you've gotten through that, I want you to read The Intelligent Investor by Ben Graham. I want you to do this. That's an investment book. If you like that book, I want you to read Security Analysis, also by Ben Graham. If you read that book, this is my promise, if you read that book and you actually utilize the techniques shown on it, you will become rich. It's not like you may become rich, you will become rich. This is very motivational stuff to a young person that wants to get rich. And then I say to them, one more book, most impactful book in my life, a book that talks about why Economics in One Lesson, The Intelligent Investor, and Securities Analysis works. If you want to know why it works, not just that it works, you have to read Human Action. that's where I've sprung the trap. If a young person reads even portions of those 4 books, and they read each in the context of the other, with a goal to improving who they are as a human being and their financial well-being, I have them halfway to being libertarian. Not a thick libertarian, not a thin libertarian, not a paleo-libertarian, not an anarcho-capitalist, but somebody who is interested in more rather than less freedom. Somebody who is interested in self-reliance, which is all I'm trying to do.
What was the 4th one?
Human action. And by the way, this is just my choice. Human Action was an extremely influential book in my life because it sort of codified for me volition and how things work. It put the intelligent investor in context for me. But it's, it's a pretty profoundly libertarian book. The 7th thing that I've learned is to borrow credibility. While I have some credibility in some circles, there are lots of people who I can cite that have a lot more credibility. If I'm talking about investing, I say, there's this old guy. He's been a pretty good investor over time. His name is Warren Buffett. You may have heard of him. And then I make my point using a Warren Buffett quote. Conversely, now, if I'm talking to a young African-American audience, and I have a point that I want to introduce to them, rather than using an old quote from an old, fat, bald white guy, I give them a quote, and I say, you know who that quote was from? Any guesses? That quote was from Malcolm X. I've borrowed credibility. Clearly, I'm not Malcolm X. Clearly, I'm not Warren Buffett. But if you make your point through the voice of others that have credibility, you have borrowed that credibility. This point is no longer yours. This point is the point of somebody who is clearly competent about what they're speaking in and respected by the person that you're speaking to. Everybody still with me? Am I going too fast? I'm trying to follow my 2nd thing, speak slowly and smile, being likable. Cite opponents for affirmation. Use the enemy's own verbiage to make your points. One of the things I've been doing recently on social media, I follow, by the way, all these big thinkers. I follow Freeland, Trudeau, Biden, Harris, all these people. And one of the things I've taken to doing is I'm very polite, by the way. If I'm addressing Kamala Harris, it's madam, that kind of thing. And she'll make some point about this wonderful stuff that President Biden's doing. And I said on some of my posts very recently, Ms. Harris, I Googled your comments about President Biden from the period in time in the primaries when you were running against him. And you were extremely critical. Were those lies? Or were you misinformed? Has something changed dramatically in the last 4 years? Have you ever, in fact, Googled the information that you distributed about the person that you serve in office with? And if so, what is your comment? I think it's very important where you can to dispute the information coming from your ideological opponents with their own prior statements. If people now were to use Mr. Biden's discussions of things like gun control or civil rights and segregation back in the time when he was running in a rural riding that was fairly conservative, the rationale for his options, for his actions then, when compared and contrasted with the things he says today, are radically different. And rather than disputing him, you're better off letting him dispute himself. I'll give you a Canadian example. When Mr. Trudeau is saying something about expenditure in Canada, I begin very politely, sir, it's interesting to read what you have to say about the distribution of public funds in Canada. When might your budget balance itself? For those of you who are Americans and don't know, Trudeau famously said some years ago he didn't care about the budget because the budget will balance itself. And I like to use that kind of statement to discredit the author of the statement. So I like to cite the opponents for affirmation of my own points. I like to establish credibility with narrative by using unassailable statistics. I don't like to lead with statistics because they put people to sleep. So I lead with the narrative, but then I use irrefutable statistics to justify the narrative. When people talk about, as an example, the American budget, here's some statistics. The on-balance sheet liabilities of the US government exceed $34 trillion. But that's not the worst of it. Entitlements, the off-balance sheet liabilities of the American government, according to the Congressional Budget Office, not some cranky old libertarian, according to the other side, exceed $100 trillion. So the aggregate liability of Americans to each other exceeds $130 trillion. Now, our efforts to pay this off are increasing the unfunded liabilities, not the unfunded liabilities, the on-balance sheet liabilities, by $1 trillion every 100 days. You need to ask them, do you get out of a hole by continuing to dig? How is this affordable? This statistic is very useful for dealing with younger audiences because I can say, placing the blame on myself, my generation has voted ourselves all kinds of cool benefits. We spent all kinds of money on ourselves, every possible win, but we forgot to pay for it. That's up to you. How do you feel about that? Combining the narrative, combining empathy with unassailable statistics is very helpful. I was engaged in an online discussion not too long ago about fossil fuels and nuclear power and that kind of stuff with a group of actually fairly likable opponents who were talking about the wonderful technologies associated with alternative energies. And I kept my tongue for a little while, said, you know, I've invested in alternative energies with not much success, but that notwithstanding, I've tried for a long time. But I want to leave you with a couple numbers. The first number is this. There's 1 billion people on Earth with no access to primary electricity at all. There's another 2 billion people on Earth with access to unaffordable or intermittent electricity. All those people want to live like you. So the first thing you need to decide is whether or not you think they have the right to do that. That's the first thing you need to decide. The second thing is you have to overcome the arithmetic. In the last 40 years on Earth, we have spent now $5.2 trillion on alternative energy generation. And we've reduced the market share of fossil fuels from a high of 82% all the way down to 81%. So you have to juxtapose these two numbers, 1 billion people on Earth with no access to electricity that want it, and the fact that a $5.2 trillion investment has reduced the market share of fossil fuels from 82 to 81. If you can talk me through how to do that, I'm on your side. Narrative with irrefutable statistics. Polite questions. One of the problems that I used to have with social media when I was somewhat more inflammatory was that my posts would get dropped. They'd go to post heaven, you know? I mean, they wouldn't kick me off, they'd just delete my posts. And what I found, maybe Albert helped me with this, or maybe I figured it out myself, I don't know. But the exclusionary algorithms don't count questions. So rather than saying, Mr. Biden, I think you're an effing a-hole, which I guess is hate speech, however accurate it might be, if I say, sir, might I inquire, and then with, by the way, excessive politeness perhaps bordering on sarcasm, I defeat the censoring mechanisms. Try it. It's astonishing. Since I started framing my criticism as a question, I have never, on any social media platform, been deleted. I also think that utilizing that technique, I've made myself much more palatable to at least the unswayed with regards to the argument. By the way, I don't discourage sarcasm. I just think that excessive politeness is the most intelligent form of sarcasm. After you've done all these things, after you've accessed other people's network, after you've delivered benefit to buyer, you have to build your own proprietary network. If your network is all on YouTube, if your network is all on Facebook, if your network is all on Twitter or whatever, it's not your network. It's important that you have to have your own capture mechanism, your own website. Albert and I have Rule Investment Media. After we have established our credibility with people, we have to give somebody something. We have to have a fulfillment mechanism that causes them to come and leave their data with us and give us permission to continue to comment to them. It might be an article. It might be an invitation to an online seminar. In my particular case, anybody who emails our site and emails me their natural resource portfolio, I will grade it. And by the way, this is extremely expensive for me to maintain that database. And I'll give them that information for free, for no obligation, no cost, anything. What I've been able to do then is build a very, very, very large community, much like Agora did. Sorry, closer, yep. Much like Agora did. I've built a community which is now my community. It's not LinkedIn's community, it's not YouTube's community, it's not Twitter's community, it's our community. So it's important that you do that. So let's go over again. Leverage other people's community. Understand their need for content. Understand that you're not advertising to somebody. Understand that you have to give people something that they value so that they trust you, they care about what you have to say, and they ask you to continue to contact them. Foster, after you've built your own community, agreeing voices. As a consequence, as an example of building a fairly large audience at Rule Investment Media and the Rule Classroom, I give the opportunity for many people who have points of view that I think are useful to my audience to access my own audience. I leverage the community that I've created by allowing other people, like-minded people, to access it. Those of you who heard Albert Liu last night give that wonderful lecture at the dinner understand something about the fact that if I can help amplify the voices of 50 Albert Lius as a consequence of having created my own community, that I have 50 times the impact that I would otherwise have. Foster agreement. I want to go over this again and again and again. Don't insult your audience. Don't repulse your audience. Use feel, felt, found, or some other form of verbal jujitsu to establish empathy with your audience so that your audience has the chance to agree with you. Finally, for myself, I want to do a little plug for the fact that I'm a director now of Students for Liberty, the organization that I mentioned at the beginning of the discussion. We managed last year to reach 160,000 students last year who came to our events. Now, I'm not suggesting that you necessarily support Students for Liberty, although I'd love to see it. What I'm trying to suggest is that there are ways that you can amplify your message, that you can amplify our message. If it isn't Students for Liberty, it might be the Atlas Foundation, it might be Capitalism and Morality. It's important to understand that in terms of making the world safer and more free, that you must at once engage with people who don't agree with you, offer them value, attract them, and then leverage the community that you've established by amplifying other voices. Thank Thank you for your attention. I hope this has been fun, and I hope it's successful for you.